All right, so just to start, can you please give us your name and what you do for a living?
Yeah, I'm Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm also an author, and I spend my time focusing on the issues I care about advancing for American culture.
What interested you in writing about the phenomenon of woke ideology and its intersection with corporate America?
So, look, I wasn't born into elite America by any stretch, but I had lived it for the last 15 or 16 years. Gone to Harvard for college, went to Yale for law school, started a multi-billion-dollar biotech company that I led as CEO for 7 years. And I began to grow concerned about what I saw as a growing gap between what people were willing to say in public and what people were willing to say in private, especially in our most elite and coveted institutions, especially in business environments. And actually, even as a CEO, I had the experience in 2020, for example, of having to lead an employee base that in the wake of George Floyd's tragic killing and the rise of the Black Lives Matter protests and riots across the country, wanting to say something in favor of the BLM movement. Pressures on me from many different angles as a capitalist, as a CEO, as a leader of a business to wade into social issues. And I thought that there was something unusual about that. It betrayed my understanding of what a business was supposed to do. And I started reflecting more on what bothered me about it. And it wasn't so much that I thought it was going to make me less successful in running a business or even make the business that I was responsible for leading less successful. That wasn't quite my issue with it, actually. That might have been Milton Friedman's issue. It's not my issue. My issue was the opposite. I actually felt that someone that was in the position that I was, who had been successful as an investor at a hedge fund and then the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, educated at the country's elite institutions, I should really not have any more of a voice in determining the answers to those social and political questions than the neighbors who I grew up with in Central Ohio and in Southwest Ohio. But what this new model of so-called stakeholder capitalism, as they call it, demands is that business leaders wield greater moral authority on settling political questions than other everyday citizens. And to me, that was a betrayal of what the American vision for democracy was supposed to be all about, where we as citizens settle those questions together through free speech and open debate. I didn't want business leaders, including business leaders like myself, exercising an outsized say about what people were supposed to think on issues where our views are supposed to count equally as citizens. So that's what led me to write the book.
Right. So you mentioned George Floyd. What do you think was the real reason that so many CEOs did issue statements about BLM and George Floyd and commitments to antiracism?
So look, I think it's really complicated. Part of this traces back to the 2008 financial crisis, which began and created this new apologist model of capitalism. And I recognize and remember this pretty well because I got my first job in New York City after graduating from college in the fall of 2007, on the eve of the '08 crisis. What happened in the '08 crisis was actually pretty meaningful, I think, for the history of capitalism in this country, for the history of social movements in this country, in ways that we still are struggling to wrap our heads around a decade and a half later. What happened was that big business, Wall Street in particular, banks in particular, paid their employees and their CEOs a lot of money when times were good, but then when times went bad, the public ended up bailing them out. And I think that created an existential crisis, literally an existential crisis for the heart and soul of American capitalism, where Occupy Wall Street was on Wall Street's doorstep. They demanded that something different be done. The Occupy Wall Street vision was to take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people to help poor people, okay? Agree or not, that's what the old left had to say. But right around that time, capitalist elites in this country recognized that there was also the birth of this new movement on the left. Not quite the Occupy Wall Street left, not quite the redistributionist, economically focused left, but a new racially obsessed wing of the left, a new gender identity obsessed wing of the left, a new LGBTQ plus obsessed wing of the left, the woke left, that said that the real problem wasn't quite economic injustice or poverty, it was this racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And that actually presented an opportunity of a generation, but a complicated choice for Wall Street and big business to make in this country, where they thought that Occupy Wall Street was a pretty tough pill to swallow, but this new woke stuff might actually be a little bit easier. Applaud diversity and inclusion. Put some token minorities on your boards. Muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to a fancy ski town. This is pretty good work, actually, if you could get it. And so they made a shift in their strategy to recognize that the public demanded something new of American capitalism. The old model of greed is good wasn't going to be good enough. They needed to come up with something else instead. That's when the ESG movement really was born. That's when stakeholder capitalism was really born or caught on fire. And then what we saw was this new merger between Wall Street and big business and eventually Silicon Valley and much of the rest of corporate America with this new woke left. They didn't really love each other. I'm not saying that they fell in love. This was an arranged marriage. It was not a marriage of love. It was closer to mutual prostitution, actually. But what they did was they gave birth to this new woke capitalist movement that wasn't quite the action of big government, but nor was it the action of classical markets and private enterprise. It was a new hybrid of both that together created this new monster that was far more powerful than either one of those forces alone. And I think that's the origin story that we're still continuing to pay the price of today. I think it is the cultural cost of the 2008 financial crisis that continues to reverberate through our economy and our economic system today.
Right. There's a lot of different ways I could go from there, but I know you can't mind read. You don't know exactly why these people are doing what they're doing, the allocators that you mentioned. But if you were to guess, would you say it's purely profit-based, or are they idealists or ideologues that really want to push this agenda forward?
Yeah, I think there's a mix. Look, I think that there is the authentic version of the stakeholder capitalist, and then there's the inauthentic version. I'd say inauthentic is about 75% of it. As I say in my book, they pretend like they care about something other than profit and power, precisely to gain more profit and power. That is the defining magic trick of 21st century capitalism, okay? That is State Street, standing up a new statue of Fearless Girl, standing up to the bull on Wall Street, pretending to stand for feminism, all the while doing it when they're facing a lawsuit from their own female employees, saying they don't pay their own female employees well enough, and putting a placard at the bottom of Fearless Girl's statue with SHE, which stands not just for she, the girl, but she, the ETF, the diversity index that they charge a fee on by raising more funds into. This is the game of the woke capitalist, the inauthentic version. This is mostly what you see on Wall Street and in the investment management industry. I think that's a majority of what's going on. I think there is a minority of people who actually authentically believe the values that they're pushing. And you could make an argument that that's even more dangerous than the inauthentic kind, because it is an abuse of market power to settle political questions through the use of economic force. And to me, one of the most important hallmarks of living in a democracy is making sure that it is a country that settles its most important political questions and political disagreements through free speech and open debate rather than through the use of force. And what this new ESG-infused stakeholder capitalist movement is effectively doing is it is using force rather than political mechanisms, rather than free speech and open debate, to settle the very questions that we might otherwise disagree about as citizens. And that is fostering a new degree of resentment across our country, where on one hand you have this stakeholder capitalist movement, the ESG movement, what Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum in Davos, calls the Great Reset. His words, not mine. That's at one end of the spectrum, calling for the dissolution of boundaries between leaders in the public sector and the private sector to work together to implement their vision for the common good globally. That is what the Great Reset is about. That is spawning on the other side what I see happening every day in this country and in Western democracies around the world, a new movement that I call the Great Uprising. That's standing up to the Great Reset. And I think that those forces are on a collision course over the next few years that will not end well. Yet it's the institutional leaders at the top of our private sector institutions working together with our leaders at the top of our public sector institutions that are fueling that conflict by sucking the air out of American democracy by saying that it's these capitalist leaders that have to make those decisions instead. So that's what I see.
Right. No, that makes sense. So you mentioned the origins of woke capitalism. Do you mind giving a brief explanation of what woke capitalism is, especially for people who are uneducated and don't know anything about ESG and all of this stuff?
Yeah, sure. So this is something I talk about. This is the core topic of my entire book, Woke Inc. But the heart of what woke capitalism refers to is the merger of neo-progressive race and identity politics obsessed left-wing values, the merger of that movement on the left with corporate power, with the use of dollars to propagate that ideology. Companies effectively espousing those social causes to fight against racial injustice, against gender-based inequalities, against microaggressions, against LGBTQIA+ individuals, and even increasingly against climate change, to take those social values and say that that's not the responsibility of citizens to address those problems. No, it is the responsibility of corporations and the cash flows that they generate to invest their dollars and allocate those dollars in a way that addresses these problems. So that's what woke capitalism refers to as the merger of this newly woke wing of the left. We can define even what we mean by woke ideology. In a nutshell, it means being obsessed with race, gender, sexual orientation, and possibly climate change. I can give you the more academic version later, but a merger of woke ideology with the workings of American business. That's what this new trend refers to.
Right. So I live in Portland, which is the woke capital of the world, and I know a lot of progressives and liberals who, when they hear something like that, they think, well, how is that a bad thing? We're fighting anti-racism, we're fighting against sexism, et cetera.
So look, I think there's two layers and two layers to the answer to that question. One is on the substantive merits itself. Is the right way to fight racism through implementing racial quota systems, as the anti-racist movement demands? Or is it some other way? And I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth here. I'm going to quote you Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Early in the book, he says something almost exactly, if not exactly, to the effect of, the remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. I'm pretty sure I'm quoting him exactly, if not very closely, from his book. So not from me, but from the proponents of this movement. That's what anti-racism stands for in this country. You can agree with it, or you can disagree with it. You could agree with him, Ibram Kendi, or you could agree with John Roberts, the Supreme Court Justice, who said the best way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I fall in the John Roberts school. Other people may fall in the Ibram Kendi school, but there are legitimate disagreements about whether the anti-racist movement is solving racism in the United States or whether it is causing racism in the United States. I happen to think it is causing racism in the United States. I think you could say the same about many of the other, I believe, self-defeating solutions proposed by this neo-progressive left that may be well-intentioned in the problems they want to solve, but may implement solutions that actually make those very underlying problems worse, as I think the anti-racism movement is doing to underlying racism in the United States. However, that is a separate substantive debate that is different from another question. And the other question is a totally independent one. It is whether, no matter what your views are on the underlying substantive question of how to fight racism, the question of whether we should want corporations in this country to be responsible for settling that question. And I think that whether you're on the right or the left, whether you're woke or whether you're arch conservative, you ultimately ought to agree as an American, as a citizen of our country, that we want to settle these questions through healthy, open, authentic disagreement and debate in the public square as citizens, rather than through economic force where Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, and a couple of his cronies get to sit in a back corner office and decide what vision of society is right for the rest of us. And if you don't like the woke vision they advocate today, note that they might actually push an alternative vision tomorrow. The CCP is already the Chinese Communist Party has in fact already weaponized many of these companies to be able to advance the Chinese vision for authoritarianism around the world in ways that actually should make most progressives shudder. But the point is, once you turn corporations into vectors for advancing a progressive ideology, they can be vectors for advancing any ideology. And this is a place where I think liberals and conservatives ought to come together to reject the use of corporate force to settle these questions that we'd rather disagree with one another in the open as citizens, even if that means that one side might win sometimes and the other side might win the other times. That's still a better and more functioning democratic and republican society than one in which it's actually a small group of corporate emperors that make those decisions behind closed doors.
Right, so the problem is a small group of elite sort of determining what we should care about in the social sphere.
Right, this isn't just a question of left versus right, it is a question of democracy versus monarchy. That is what's at stake. It was the battle we fought at the start of the American Revolution. It was the battle that we have fought ever since. It is a battle between whether the everyday citizen determines his own destiny in the vision for the common good that he participates in the society and country he's a part of, or whether it is a group of self-appointed autocrats, monarchs, really, modern monarchs, that make the decision of what constitutes our shared vision for the common good. That's what's at stake here. It's not about left-wing or right-wing politics in the United States, though often it takes that form on cable television. It is actually about what is the essence of living in a democracy itself. Is it ones where citizens self-govern and determine the answer to political questions together through debate, or is it one where a monarch maybe not a monarch on the other side of the ocean. Maybe it's a monarch this time on this side of the ocean, empowered on top of a $10 trillion empire, if you're Larry Fink, that uses his dollars as a weapon to settle those questions instead. That's what's at stake here.
Right. As I mentioned, I live in Portland. Most of my friends are liberals, and I'm kind of making this series to hopefully appeal to some liberals, to reflect on some of the beliefs they have, to maybe rethink adopting some of these woke values. So what would you say to liberals who are concerned about the ideals that woke capitalism claims to push for? What would you tell those liberals who think like it's a good thing?
Yeah, look, I think that I would ask you to distinguish between how much you authentically care about the underlying causes you're pushing for, which might be authentic and heartfelt, versus who you want to make a steward of the causes that you actually care about. It's like thinking about hiring a nanny for your baby, okay? You want to hire a nanny who actually loves your baby and actually loves your child, not somebody who does it as a chore strictly to advance their own self-interest in their own life, viewing your child instrumentally to advance their own goals. Sure, we live in a free market system, but we also want, when something that you care most about, you want the steward to actually have an authentic commitment to that cause itself. And in 75% of the cases, I would say to someone who's as far on the left of the spectrum as you can go, you should not trust corporations to be an authentic steward of the causes that you actually care about. To the contrary, they will, when the political winds shift in the other direction, wave immediately back in that direction. It's like a flag that may look nice today, but it will wave in whatever direction the wind is blowing on a given day. Now, let's say even somebody authentically did care about it. Let's just say the tables were turned and you had somebody who authentically cared about political perspectives that were diametrically the opposite of the ones that you yourself hold today. Well, if you wouldn't want force being used to settle those questions, you shouldn't want force being used to settle these questions either.
I'd love to touch on two more things. One would be the religious aspect and your legal argument, and then talk about potential solutions to the problem. So in terms of wokeness being a religion, can you talk about why you think it's a religion and maybe a solution also, which is to separate church and state?
Yeah, so look, I think that wokeness has increasingly become a sort of religion in corporate America and across our culture more generally. There are certain words you can't say, clothes you can't wear, apologies you must recite, in some cases excommunication procedures that must be initiated if you have transgressed in the wrong way. There's no path to redemption, like many religions do offer. Apologies don't necessarily work in the cancel culture created by modern wokeism in the United States, but it has a fundamentally religious quality to it. But I'm not just saying that in a colloquial sense, although others, John McWhorter or others have made that argument. I've made it in my book as well on independent grounds. But I actually mean it in a much narrower sense, a much more rigorous legal sense of the word. I think wokeness literally meets the Supreme Court's test for what counts as a religion. I talk about this extensively in the book. And once you realize that wokeness meets the Supreme Court test for what counts as a religion, does it have a view on a comprehensive set of beliefs? Is it authentically held? White supremacy actually was the hallmark feature of a strange religion, certainly not one that I subscribe to, called creativity. The Supreme Court held that creativity, a religion that professed white supremacy as its core belief set, if creativity counted as a religion, then certainly wokeness, which professes anti-white supremacy as its core tenet and belief set, probably counts as a religion too. Even secular humanism, actually, by the way, has been held by the Supreme Court to enjoy certain civil rights protections as a religion. Wokeness meets that test too. But if wokeness meets that test, there's something really interesting that follows from it. Okay. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevents discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin. But as it pertains to religion, that doesn't just mean that an employer cannot discriminate against an employee on account of the employee's religion. It does mean that, but that's only half the story. According to extensive case law in this country, it also means that the employer cannot force the employee to bow down to the employer's religion. And what we see really happening today, Gina Carano fired from Disney, I mean, pick your favorite example of employee cancellations or employee punishments, isn't necessarily that Gina Carano was expressing a religious view that the employer discriminated against her for. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying something different. I'm saying the employer has adopted a religious worldview, the woke worldview, and that they're forcing their employees to bend the knee to that new religion. Okay, that is every bit as much of a Title VII violation as the inverse kind where they would fire an employee for adhering to the wrong religion. Nobody's made that legal argument in court today. And I think that is one of the solutions today of taking up legal doctrines that we already have from Supreme Court canons in this country, already existing laws. We don't need new ones to be passed. To be able to say what is happening today in corporate America at behest of this new woke religion is fundamentally illegal. I'll give you another example in Silicon Valley today, where actually the conventional wisdom says that companies should be able to take down content that doesn't show up on the internet. That's what normal private companies are free to do. I say that's right if they're actually behaving as private companies. But in this case, what are we seeing? We're seeing actually private companies working together with government actors behind closed doors, taking threats from the government and responding to them, responding to inducements from the government, sometimes willfully coordinating with the government to take down speech online that's offensive, that's deemed to be hate speech or misinformation or whatever. But to be able to do that through the back door because government could not do it directly under the First Amendment to the Constitution. So that's another example of a legal argument hiding in plain sight. It's not hiding anymore because I lay it out in my book. I've laid it out on the pages of the Wall Street Journal. But the argument is this, that if it is state action in disguise, then the Constitution still applies. If the government is working with a private party to do through the back door what government could not do directly through the front door by advancing this neo-progressive orthodoxy and censoring certain content that the government could not censor under the First Amendment, then actually the companies that are used as instruments of the government are also, in that narrow sense, bound by the First Amendment. So that's one of the solution sets that I'm actually very optimistic about in the coming years, is not necessarily passing new laws. All new laws have unintended consequences, and so we have to be really careful about passing new laws. I do favor some new laws, and I'm happy to talk about them. But I actually think that there are legal arguments under existing laws handed down for years of Supreme Court canons that are hiding in plain sight that everyday individuals who have been deplatformed by a social media site to fired by an employer are going to be able to avail themselves of in court today that hopefully change the cultural tides back to a more healthy place.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you'd like to see more of my work, you can head on over to Locals, which is an awesome free speech platform that won't take down or flag any videos, which YouTube is known to do. It's a great platform because people want to be there and they'll engage in meaningful dialogue with you, and it's awesome. Plus, if you sign up for a paid account, you can get access to content that is exclusive to Locals. You'll find a link for that in the description below. Also, if you ever see me lying down in interviews or in any of the videos, it's because I lived with debilitating back pain for years. So I just wanted to explain that so you understand what's going on. And sometimes my little dog Nora might make an appearance. Nora, come here. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right. Thanks, everybody.